In the year 65 AD, the Roman Emperor Nero did something that stunned even his own court. At the funeral of his wife Poppaea, he ordered a full year's supply of the city's cinnamon thrown onto the flames and burned in a single afternoon. Not eaten, not sold, burned, as a display of grief and raw power over the smoke of the Roman Forum. This was a curl of tree bark that traded for more than its weight in gold, a spice people swallowed as medicine and packed into the bodies of their dead. And to keep its true source hidden, the men who sold it had already been lying about it for 1,000 years. The story of how this healing spice was found and how many people were worked to death and killed over it is far darker than anything sitting in your kitchen cupboard right now. To understand it, we have to travel through 3 ages of cinnamon. First, the age of the LIE, when nobody in Europe knew where it grew and traders wanted it that way. Second, the age of medicine, when this bark was trusted to cure plague, ward off death, and anoint kings. And third, the age of blood, when a small green island in the Indian Ocean became the center of one of the most brutal monopolies in the history of the spice trade. By the end, you will understand why the cheapest jar on the supermarket shelf was once a thing men were willing to kill for. Let us begin at the beginning, with a bird that never existed. For most of the ancient world, cinnamon arrived in the markets of the Mediterranean with no address attached to it. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, all of them bought it, prized it, and had no reliable idea where it actually came from. That was not an accident. The Arab and Phoenician traders who carried it west understood something that every good middleman understands. If your customers know where the product grows, they can cut you out, so they made sure nobody knew. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote down the stories they told, and they are genuinely something. According to the tale, cinnamon sticks were gathered by enormous birds that used them to build their nests high on cliffs no man could climb. To harvest it, the story went, traders would leave out huge chunks of ox meat below the nests. The birds would carry the heavy meat up. The nests would break under the weight. The cinnamon would tumble down, and only then could it be collected. Another version had the spice growing in deep valleys guarded by winged serpents that had to be driven off with smoke. None of it was true. Every word of it was invented, marketing designed to justify a sky-high price and to make the source sound so dangerous and so remote that no buyer would ever go looking for it. And it worked for over 1,000 years. Think about the scale of that deception. A single lie about a spice held up across the rise and fall of entire empires, defended not with armies but with a good story. While Europe traded in myths, the spice was already deeply woven into the rituals of the dead. In ancient Egypt, cinnamon and its close cousin cassia were among the aromatic substances used in embalming, packed into the body cavities of the wealthy to slow decay and to carry a sacred scent into the afterlife. The Egyptians had no local source for it at all. It had to travel thousands of miles across the Indian Ocean and up through Arabia to reach them, which only made it more precious. To be buried with cinnamon was a mark of status that outlasted death itself. It reached higher still. In the book of Exodus, when the holy anointing oil is prepared, cinnamon is named directly as one of its ingredients, mixed with myrrh and other spices, and set aside for sacred use. This had nothing to do with flavoring food. It was a substance fit for temples and kings, so valuable that using it for ordinary purposes was forbidden. Cinnamon sat at the very top of the ancient world's hierarchy of scent and worth. And that brings us back to Nero and his funeral pyre. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder recorded that burning, and he was not impressed. Pliny was one of the few ancient voices who openly called out the fraud. He wrote that the fantastical stories about cinnamon were fables invented by the people who sold it to raise the price, and he put actual numbers to the outrage. In his time, the finest cinnamon could sell for hundreds of denarii per pound. To put that in perspective, an ordinary Roman laborer or soldier might earn around a single denarius for a day's work. A man could labor for the better part of a year and still not afford 1 pound of the good stuff. Pliny understood the game perfectly. The wilder the legend, the fatter the profit for the trader in the middle. So that is the first age. A spice with no known home, protected by 1,000 years of invented monsters, prized by pharaohs and emperors, and priced beyond reach. Now let's move to the second age, and this is where the healing begins, because for most of history, people did not just flavor their food with cinnamon. They treated it as one of the most trusted medicines on earth. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing his great work on medicine in the 1st century, listed cinnamon as a remedy to be taken seriously. He described it as warming, as good for the digestion, useful against coughs and internal complaints, and valuable in treatments for women. Galen, the physician whose theories would dominate European medicine for more than 1,000 years after him, folded cinnamon into the same framework. In their system of the body, illness came from imbalance among the humours, and cinnamon was classed as hot and dry, a spice that could push a cold, sluggish body back toward health. Cinnamon even earned a place inside the most famous medicine of the ancient and medieval world, a compound called Theriac. Theriac was the ultimate cure-all, a mixture of dozens of ingredients that was believed to protect against poison and plague alike. Kings and emperors took it as a daily safeguard, and it stayed in European pharmacies for well over 1,000 years. To be an ingredient in Theriac was to be trusted at the highest possible level, and cinnamon was on the list. Then came the age when that trust was tested by the worst disaster medieval Europe ever faced. When the Black Death swept across the continent in the 14th century, killing tens of millions of people, the terrified survivors reached for whatever they believed could save them. The medicine of the day taught that disease traveled through bad air, a poisonous stench they called miasma. If corruption came through smell, then the answer was to surround yourself with strong, pleasant scents. And so the wealthy carried pomanders, small perforated containers packed with spices, cinnamon among them, held to the nose to keep the deadly air at bay. Doctors added cinnamon to their plague recipes. People burned aromatic spices in their homes hoping to purify the air. None of it stopped the plague, of course, but it tells you exactly how cinnamon was seen. This was a shield against death, and it was expensive enough that only the rich could afford the protection. The poor breathed the same air and simply died. And that is the strange knot at the heart of this story. The reason cinnamon was worth so much was never really its taste. It was the belief that it healed, that it protected, that it belonged with the sacred and the dying. That belief created demand. That demand created staggering prices. And staggering prices, in the end, created a reason to fight, to conquer, and to kill, which is exactly where the Third Age begins. For centuries, the spice had crossed the world by a route almost as secretive as its origin. Cinnamon moved out of the east on ships that rode the monsoon winds across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, then overland by camel caravan toward the ports of the eastern Mediterranean. From there, one city seized control of the final leg into Europe and grew fabulously rich doing it: Venice. For generations, the Venetians were the gatekeepers of the spice trade, buying from Arab middlemen in Alexandria and selling on to the rest of Europe at whatever price they pleased. Nearly every pinch of cinnamon that reached a French table or a German apothecary had passed through Venetian hands, and Venice guarded that position with everything it had. That stranglehold is exactly what sent other Europeans looking for a way around it. If a nation could sail directly to the source, it could cut out Venice, cut out the Arab traders, and swallow the entire profit itself. That single ambition helped launch the whole age of exploration. When the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama rounded the southern tip of Africa and reached India by sea in 1498, he did not just open a new trade route, he detonated the old one. The middlemen who had guarded their monsters and their myths for 1,000 years were about to be cut out of the story entirely. Because now, at last, the LIE ran out. Europeans found the source with their own eyes. The finest cinnamon in the world grew on a single island off the southern tip of India, an island the Europeans came to call Ceylon, known today as Sri Lanka. And in 1505, a Portuguese fleet under Lourenço de Almeida was blown onto its shores. From that moment, cinnamon stopped being a story about myths and medicine and became a story about empire. The Portuguese quickly grasped what the island offered. They built a fort at Colombo, pressed the local kingdom of Quota into an alliance that soon curdled into domination and demanded tribute paid in cinnamon. Enormous quantities of it, harvested and handed over year after year. For the first time in history, a single European power controlled cinnamon at its root, and they intended to keep it. But the work of actually producing it fell on a group of people who paid the highest price of all. Peeling cinnamon is a genuine craft. The bark has to be cut and stripped from the young shoots of the tree at exactly the right moment in the season, scraped and rolled by hand into the tight quills we still recognize today. Do it wrong, and the bark is ruined. On Ceylon, this skilled labor was bound to a specific caste of peelers, the Salagama, sometimes called the Chalia. Under the Portuguese, and far more harshly under those who came next, these peelers did not choose their work. Their trade, their labor, and their quotas were fixed by their birth and enforced by their masters. Now, halfway through our story, here is where the island changes hands and where the real machine of death gets built. Because the Portuguese were not the last Europeans to want Ceylon. The Dutch East India Company, the largest and most ruthless trading corporation the world had ever seen, decided that the cinnamon of Ceylon would be theirs. They made a deal with the inland kingdom of Kandy, whose king wanted the Portuguese gone from his coast. The Dutch would supply the ships and the cannon, Kandy would supply the alliance, and together they would drive the Portuguese into the sea. It was a long and bloody campaign. Gale fell first. Then, after a punishing siege that starved the defenders, Colombo fell in 1656. 2 years later, in 1658, the last Portuguese stronghold at Jaffna surrendered. The island's cinnamon now answered to Amsterdam. And here is the betrayal that tells you what this was really about. The Dutch had promised the coastal lands to their ally, the King of Kandy. They never handed them over. Having spent the Portuguese out of the picture, the Dutch simply installed themselves as the new masters of the cinnamon coast and kept it. The King of Kandy had traded one European occupier for another, and there was nothing he could do about it. What the Dutch built next was a monopoly enforced with a cruelty that was cold and deliberate. They created an entire government department to run the cinnamon operation, a body known as the Mahabada, which controlled the peeler caste, set the quotas, and collected the harvest. The company did not just want to sell cinnamon. It wanted to control every single stick of it on earth, because it understood that scarcity was the entire point. So it demanded fixed weights of peeled cinnamon from the caste, measured out to the pound and delivered on schedule, whether the harvest had been good that year or not. Fall short, deliver bark that was too thick or too poorly cured, and the peeler answered for it. The obligations passed down through families, so that a man was born already owing cinnamon to a company on the other side of the world. And the trees themselves were placed under protection so extreme that, by Dutch law, harming or destroying a cinnamon plant could cost a person their life. Smuggling even a small amount of cinnamon past the company was punishable by death. And then there is the detail that captures the whole logic of the monopoly better than anything else. When the Dutch found themselves holding more cinnamon than they wanted to sell, when there was a risk that too much supply might push the price down, they burned it. Great quantities of perfectly good cinnamon, set on fire in the warehouses of Amsterdam, deliberately destroyed to keep the world price high. The same spice Nero had burned in grief, the Dutch now burned in cold accounting. A thing people had once treated as sacred medicine turned to ash to protect a margin on a ledger. The people who suffered most were the peelers. Bound to impossible quotas, punished for shortfalls, cut off from any other way to live, the Salagama eventually reached their breaking point. In the 1760s, that resentment boiled over into open revolt, tangled together with a wider war between the Dutch company and the Kingdom of Kandy. The uprising was crushed, but it exposed the truth of the system. This was not commerce, it was forced extraction, held in place by the threat of the gallows, on an island that had been turned into a single vast plantation for a single spice. The Dutch grip on Ceylon cinnamon lasted almost a century and a half. But no empire built on one point of control lasts forever. In 1796, as the wars of revolutionary Europe redrew the map, the British took the island from the Dutch, and the world's most valuable cinnamon changed masters one final time. And here, after all the sieges and quotas and executions, comes the twist that quietly undoes the entire empire of blood. For centuries, the value of cinnamon had rested on one fragile fact. It was rare, and the best of it grew in only one place that a single power could guard. But the Dutch themselves, near the end, had already begun shifting from harvesting wild trees to planting organized cinnamon gardens. And once you learn to plant cinnamon on purpose, the secret is out of your hands forever. The tree could be grown elsewhere. Cuttings and seeds spread beyond Ceylon to other tropical colonies, places like Java, and later islands in the Indian Ocean and beyond. The moment cinnamon could be grown almost anywhere, the spell broke. Supply climbed. The price fell, and then it kept falling and falling. The bark that had funded forts and monopolies and death sentences slid down the value of the market until it landed in the one place nobody in the ancient world would ever have predicted: the bottom shelf. Within a few generations, cinnamon went from a treasure guarded by executioners to a cheap flavoring dusted over a breakfast bun. Which brings us, finally, to the jar in your kitchen and to the last question worth asking. Is any of the old belief actually true? Is cinnamon really the healthiest spice, the way the internet loves to claim? The honest answer is more careful than the headlines. Start with the fact that most cinnamon sold in the world today is not the fine Ceylon cinnamon the Dutch died fighting over. It is a cheaper relative called cassia, and cassia carries a natural compound called coumarin. In high enough doses, coumarin can damage the liver. European food safety authorities were concerned enough to set a strict tolerable daily intake, a limit of about 0.1 milligrams of coumarin per kilogram of body weight per day, and cheap cassia can blow past that surprisingly easily. This is not a theoretical worry. In 2013, Denmark ended up in a genuine public fight over the amount of cassia in its traditional cinnamon pastries, its beloved Kanelsnegel, because the coumarin levels ran over the European limits. The newspapers happily called the whole affair Cinnamon Gate. The healthiest spice, it turns out, comes with a legal maximum printed on it. As for the famous claim that cinnamon lowers blood sugar, the research does exist, but it is modest and mixed. Some studies show small effects, others show almost nothing, and no serious scientist would ever tell you to trade your medicine for your spice rack. Cinnamon does have real antimicrobial and anti-inflammatory properties that researchers continue to study, and true Ceylon cinnamon, low in coumarin, is a fine thing to enjoy. It is not a miracle, and it never was. The ancient world was wrong about the birds, wrong about the plague, wrong about the winged serpents guarding the valleys. But they were right about one thing. There has always been something about this particular bark that makes people believe. So the next time you dust a little cinnamon over your coffee, remember what you are actually holding. A spice that fooled empires with invented monsters for 1,000 years. A medicine people trusted against the Black Death. A fortune that turned a green island into a prison of quotas and gallows, and that burned in the fires of both a grieving emperor and a cold-blooded corporation. Men killed to keep it rare. In the end, it took the collapse of an empire to make it common. If this story was worth your time, think about subscribing, because I spend my days digging up the hidden history behind the ordinary things we eat, one spice at a time. There are far more of these stories than you would ever guess, and almost none of them are as sweet as they smell.